God truly does love a trier, and that being the case, it's tough to think of anyone who's tried harder to break into the superhero genre than Sony Pictures. I mean, they definitely got off to a good start with the Sam Raimi Spider-Man films, but ever since then, it's basically been a downward spiral of mediocrity. Their insistence that Spider-Man 3 be used as a launch pad for like half a dozen other characters soured their relationship with Raimi and basically killed the prospect of a fourth movie, and the Amazing Spider-Man reboot turned out to be a bigger contradiction in terms than referring to James Corden as an entertainer. Things got so bad that they actually had to partner up with Marvel to produce yet another reboot of Spider-Man. I mean, Homecoming certainly didn't suck, but let's be honest, it was hardly a definitive cinematic experience either. Basically, it was just another reliable cookie-cutter Marvel film that was lucky enough to star an iconic character, and it says a lot about the state of cinema today that reliable and cookie-cutter have somehow become ringing endorsements. Anyway, the success of the rebooted Spider-Man movies convinced Sony to have yet another crack at launching their own cinematic universe, and the first step down that road was Venom in 2018, a comic book anti-hero movie so completely middle of the road and forgettable that I've seen it twice now, and the only two things I can tell you about it is that it's got Tom Hardy in it, and the bits where he argues with Venom made me chuckle at times. So I wasn't exactly brimming with excitement when they announced a sequel, Venom, Let There Be Carnage. But hey, in a theatrical year that's been more empty and barren than Matt Jarbo's Patreon account, even a mediocre sequel to a not particularly special comic book movie is better than nothing, I guess. So I duly paid my money and went along to watch Venom 2 one rainy night in October, and 2 hours later I emerged from the theatre thinking, yeah, that was a movie. Wait, what the fuck did I just watch? Venom 2 could best be summed up as the cinematic equivalent of eating a bowl of ramen noodles for dinner. It'll fill you up, I guess, but it's not exactly a thrilling experience. The movie picks up a year or two after the events of the first film. Eddie Brock's still working as an investigative journalist, he's broken up with his girlfriend, and he and Venom aren't getting on very well. Venom wants more freedom to get out into the world and fight criminals so he can eat them and sustain himself, but Eddie keeps him on a short leash and prevents him from killing anyone. Needless to say, Venom's not happy. Matters come to a head when Eddie gets summoned to a local prison to do an interview with notorious serial killer Cletus Cassidy, who's on death row. Cassidy ends up provoking Venom into attacking him so he can bite Eddie's hand, which causes him to ingest part of Venom's symbiotes. Yeah, sure, okay. This confrontation proves to be the last straw for Eddie and Venom, who violently separate from each other, with Venom taking over a new host so he can be his own man, or alien or something. Unfortunately, none of the new hosts are compatible with him, and he ends up burning through them quicker than Kathleen Kennedy burns through directors who demonstrate a shred of individual creativity. Anyway, when Cassidy's execution comes around, the symbiote inside him activates to preserve its own life and breaks him out of prison. The two villains quickly form an alliance, becoming an entity known as Carnage, and leave to rescue Cassidy's former girlfriend from the mental asylum she's been imprisoned in for most of her life. Needless to say, Eddie and Venom have to find a way to reconcile so they can take on the threat posed by Carnage. And Eddie's former girlfriend Anne shows up for about 10 minutes so we can be reminded that she's a thing which still exists. Anyway, the action culminates in a big CGI fight inside a dilapidated church. Why are there always dilapidated churches in movies like this? Which is about as tense and dramatic as watching the two Black Panthers knocking the shit out of each other when you realise they're both pretty much indestructible. Ah, whatever. Cassidy's girlfriend has a change of heart and saves the day before getting crushed by a fucking church bell. Venom eats Carnage and Cassidy, and the movie ends with him and Eddie taking a lovely seaside vacation together. Well, that and a ridiculous post-credits attempt to set up a sequel with Spider-Man, which I'm willing to bet will never actually happen. Assessing this movie is kind of a tough prospect because honestly, it feels like there's not a whole lot to review. The story here is about as simplistic as films like this can get, and for some reason I kept getting Spider-Man 2 vibes from it. Both movies feature the protagonist struggling with their newfound powers and ultimately trying to put their superhero life behind them, only for a much bigger threat to force them back into their old ways. Both movies see the hero estranged from his love interest, pushing her into the arms of another man, and both end with the recognition that they can never really go back to the person they once were. The big difference is that Spider-Man 2 actually had an interesting story and a compelling villain, whereas Venom has Woody Harrelson desperately trying to draw something interesting out of the most boring, one-dimensional original antagonist since, well, that guy from Captain Marvel. Although you've got to love the fact that Woody Harrelson's been playing guys in their mid-40s for the past 25 years now. Cletus Cassidy is about as compelling as a 3-day seminar on the history of basket weaving in the Outer Hebrides, and it just feels like such a wasted opportunity. The movie casually drops in the fact that he was abused as a kid, and that his seemingly sadistic acts of violence might have been a little more justified than they seemed, but the script does absolutely nothing with this revelation. It doesn't invite you to see him in a more sympathetic light. It doesn't make you question whether he really is a villain, or simply the tragically damaged product of a horrendous upbringing. It doesn't even give you a chance to digest any of this really, because he's fucking dead about 60 seconds later. It's the same exact problem with his girlfriend Shriek, who has the ability to send out blasts of energy when she screams. How? Don't know. But because of these dangerous powers, she's been locked away in a prison for most of her life, tortured and experimented on by uncaring scientists. You'd think that would make her a pretty sympathetic, tragic kind of character, but nope. She's just another brain-dead, sadistic villain that's out for revenge. How fucking thrilling. Stephen Graham plays a police detective whose only real role is to be constantly baffled by everything and get his ass kicked over and over in the finale. His American accent comes and goes as frequently as Bill Murray's commitment to Ghostbusters 3, and ultimately he feels like a talented actor wasted in a thankless role. Speaking of talented actors in bad roles, I've always felt like Tom Hardy was miscast as Eddie Brock, and this film's done nothing but reinforce that opinion. He looks uncomfortable and out of place most of the time. He keeps doing this weird squeaky thing with his voice, like he's trying to play Eddie as a much younger man who's kind of naive and out of his depth. The problem is, Hardy's 44 years old now and he looks it. You can't go from playing fucking Bane to being a young, dorky slob living in a crappy apartment and expect it to work. A big part of the success of the first movie was the interplay between Brock and Venom. It was funny at times and it gave their relationship an interesting twist because they usually had wildly conflicting goals that only occasionally aligned for their mutual benefit. I guess the writers recognised that too because all this stuff gets amped up to 11 this time around. There's plenty of funny exchanges and arguments between them, and yeah, it's clearly meant to be a parody of the kind of bitching and tit for tat that happens in a romantic relationship. And that's all it is, despite the ridiculous news articles trying to paint it as an actual love story. What the fuck? How would that even work between different species anyway? Also, and this could just be me, but I feel like the movie's never all that clear on how Venom actually functions as a character. Like, most of the time he's literally just a voice in Eddie's head and all we can do is listen to him, but then other times he bursts out of him and appears visually on screen, but it's made clear that only the audience can see and hear him while other characters around him are oblivious. I mean, fair enough I guess, but then there's other times when he takes over Eddie's entire body and then everyone can see and interact with him like he's a real person. But then again, there's also a kind of weird in-between stage where bits of him shoot out to interact with objects in his environment, and I've got absolutely no idea what this means for his physical form. I mean, what would that even look like to other characters? Can they see this kind of thing, or is it just for our benefit? I guess you're not really supposed to think about it too deeply, but it just feels like the movie plays fast and loose with its own rules for the sake of an occasional laugh, when it would have been pretty easy just to stick to them. Let's be honest, they're not exactly complicated. Anyway, as funny as this stuff is, the interaction with Venom kind of feels like the only interesting and unique thing that this movie brings to the table. Strip that away and you're basically left with the most bog standard of revenge stories, featuring a collection of simplistic, uninteresting characters strung along by a bunch of dull, uninspired CGI fight scenes that we've seen a million times before. It all just feels so lackluster and pedestrian, like the movie was generated from a fucking computer algorithm or something, designed to take absolutely no chances or do anything remotely unexpected. It's the kind of film that's not memorably great or terrible, but instead occupies a kind of bland, forgettable middle ground where it doesn't make the slightest impression on you one way or the other and promptly vanishes from your mind the minute you've left the theatre. I mean, there's definitely worse ways to spend a couple of hours, but I'll be honest with you, there's also much better ways I can think of. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. Go away now.